Good morning. My name's Mike Morgan. I'm the director of the Colorado Division of Fire Prevention and Control. I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about the Colorado Fire Commission, what it is, what it's all about, and where it's going, and what those impacts are potentially going to be to the fire service as a whole in Colorado. So I've got Lisa Pine, who's the administrator for the Fire Commission. She'll be talking about some additional details of the work that's been done so far. But I want to talk a little bit first about the history and how we arrived at establishing the first Fire Commission in the state of Colorado. So to understand that, the first thing we have to talk a little bit about is Colorado's fire problem. And if you look at Colorado's fire problem, if you look at the 20 largest fires in Colorado's history, you'll find out that 5 of those occurred in 2018, 25%. 13 of those occurred between 2010 and 2018, 65%, and all 100% of the 20 largest fires in Colorado have occurred since 2000. Now, you throw in the data from 2020, okay? We now have a new number 1 largest fire, Pine Gulch, in state history. We have a new number 3 and still growing, Cameron Peak. And we also have a new number 14 with Grizzly Creek over in Glenwood Canyon. So the fire problem is continuing to get worse. Okay, so I'm going to talk a lot about wildfire today because that's kind of what this group's talking about, and that's what's drawn a lot of attention to things. But I will stress to you that the Fire Commission is not solely a group to look at wildfire only. It is a group charged with looking at the fire problem in Colorado as a whole. So keep that in the back of your mind as you think about the work the commission is doing. So all of these big fires, the first question that popped into mind was, so what? Yeah, we know we have all this data, so what? Well, are you going to do something about it? That's the next question. And that's where everything kind of started coming into play. And I'll talk about that a little bit more now. So the first concept I want everybody to think about that the division has been very focused on is duration versus impact. Now, traditionally, when the state showed up to assist a sheriff or a fire chief with a fire, we showed up after the fire had run over the hill, and we showed up with the checkbook, and we were spending a lot of money and not doing a lot to reduce the amounts of that. So what the focus has been on is what are the things that we can be doing to support local government so we have less impacts of an incident once it goes over the ridge. What can we do to help support that? So when you think about this time and impact thing, we know that when a fire goes for a long period of time, or any emergency for that matter, is that we're going to see additional risk to injury. We're going to see additional risk to death. We're going to see additional loss of costs of suppression. We're going to see additional loss of property, insured losses, recovery costs, overall economic impacts to the overall state governments and local governments and their fiscal impacts of these events. And then the downstream impacts that often we didn't think about. There's some 40 million people that rely on Colorado for its water supply for food and water. Now, it's not just a fire on the hill, a bad day for, up in the mountains. It is now an impact nationally. And often almost internationally because of the tourism in the state of Colorado. So it's a bigger thing that we're trying to take a look at. So the whole point what started this thing was we started strategic planning. How can we better serve the local governments and serve the people that live and visit Colorado? And how do we actually go about doing that? So we started a strategic planning process that was very stakeholder driven and was also very geographically driven. We wanted to make sure that what the impacts of what happens in a Logan County may be completely different than what happens in a La Plata County, and the needs are different, but it doesn't mean that we don't need to still try to strive and meet those needs. So it's very geographically driven. This came up with a strategic plan, a 5-year plan for supporting Colorado's fire service. That is uploaded, so you have access to that. So take a look at that when you have a little bit more time. And kind of the next thing that kind of came out of this was there are a lot of issues out there, and they are much, much broader again than just wildfire. And so we need to put some meaningful thought and conversation into this, and it has to be very stakeholder driven. So it came up with this concept of a fire commission, different than an advisory committee, right? The commission is accountable. It reports to the legislative body. It is charged with coming up with meaningful change to improve these things. So it is different than the traditional advisory committees, I said. But there's also groups, Forest Health Advisory Committee, and all those other groups that are focused on the mitigation, the traditional mitigation, if you will, vegetation management. We don't want to interfere. We want to support those groups, however we can to do that. We do participate in those, but we also believe that there are other things that we can do in the sense of a Merriam-Webster definition of mitigate, and that is to lessen the likelihood, the severity, or the painfulness of an event when it occurs, because we're still going to have fires. We're still going to have big fires. How can we reduce the impacts of that? And that's what, from a fire service perspective, that's what the commission is focused on. So Senate Bill 1940 is what established it. That is uploaded for you as well. You can take a look at that. You can look through the lists of organizations that are represented. It's very broad, very geographic, you will see, with different parts of the states being required to be represented on that group. And with that, I think I will turn it over to Lisa so she can talk about the work that's been done so far by the Fire Commission. Again, any questions, comments, concerns, don't hesitate to give us a shout. Thanks. Lisa, take it away.
Thanks, Mike. I'm Lisa Pine. I'm the Colorado Fire Commission Administrator, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work that the Fire Commission did during this first year. One thing I want to let you know is it's all laid out in our annual report, which went to the legislature on August 31st of this year. That is uploaded to the portal where this video is, and it's also on our website, coloradofirecommission.com. So the Fire Commission had its first meeting in October of 2019 and really laid out the plan for the year. And the plan was by July 7th, we would have approved and actionable recommendations that we could present to the legislature in our annual report. And it's really gratifying to know that we were able to accomplish that goal. In order to do that, we created 3 subcommittees: Large Wildland Fire Funding Subcommittee, Regional and Statewide Coordination of Mutual Aid Subcommittee, and a subcommittee devoted to fire data. So I want to go through a little bit of what those groups worked on, what they're tasked with, and the recommendations they came up with. So the Large Wildland Fire Funding Subcommittee was really tasked with looking at how we provide a stable, sustainable funding source to handle large wildland fires. And right now, wildland fires are paid through the Emergency Fire Fund. So counties, and not all counties in the state, but some of the counties in the state pay an assessment, and that generates about $1 million a year that DFPC uses to pay for wildland fires, the large ones, when they become state responsibility. And by state responsibility, we mean when they exceed the capacity of the local agency to handle it, and the state is brought in to take over the management of the fire. So that $1 million does not go very far. In 2018, we spent about $40 million, and that money ran out in April of that year. So the $1 million just doesn't do a lot once the fire has gotten large. So this subcommittee really looked at how do we use that money better? And they decided that it would be much better to put that $1 million on the front end, get the resources, the boots on the ground, the air resources out to a fire when it's small, put it out before it becomes state responsibility. It is no longer a good plan for us to wait until a fire has gotten large before we get involved. We really should get involved, we being DFPC, get involved early on. So that's the first recommendation. Move that $1 million plus some additional funding to support our air resources, to support DFPC resources getting on the ground, move that to the front end and get these fires out when they're small. The second recommendation had to do with getting a sustainable funding source for when fires get large. We will not be able to put them all out when they're small. Things happen, some will get large and will become state responsibility. So how do we get that stable funding source? As I mentioned, we get $1 million through the Emergency Fire Fund. And then after that money is spent, we have to go to the governor, have a disaster declared, and ask for disaster emergency funding. So in order to sort of build that bank of money so we have some to put towards fire before we have to go to the governor's office, we're asking for a 5-year rolling average of funds to be put into this. So in 2018, like I said, about $40 million was spent. 2019, $0 on state responsibility fires. So there's a fluctuation in how much money is spent each year. So that's why we decided, the commission thought a 5-year rolling average would work. And then continue to fund that fund for up through 3 years. So there's 3 years worth of money in there. And then any money above that cap would go to other fire-related programs. The commission and this subcommittee really worked very hard to come up with some ideas of how we can better fund wildland fires. And I think they really did a great job on the front end saying, let's put more resources on the front end to it and get them out when they're small and be smart about putting money aside for those days when we can't do it. The second subcommittee was the Regional and Statewide Coordination of Mutual Aid. And they really looked at how do we work mutual aid for fire service resources on a state level. So there's mutual aid plans between fire departments within counties and in some of the regions. But once an incident exceeds a region's capabilities, how do the resources come from other areas? So that's really a huge piece of what this group did, is look at how we can create a mechanism, the Colorado Coordinated Regional Mutual Aid System, how we can implement that so that there is a plan when things get very large and we have to get resources from all across the state. This recommendation came with a request for 7 additional FTE for DFPC to manage the program, for regional mutual aid coordinators that oversee sort of the dispatching of resources and how those get out, and then 1 program manager over the top. So again, this is a huge step forward in really making sure we have the resources statewide connected and brought it to bear when we need them. And the second recommendation from that group really had to do with some mutual aid language in the legislation that we looked at and needed to be tweaked a little bit. Again, just for fire service resources, not law enforcement, not out-of-state resources, just Colorado fire resources, and look at how that needs to be changed. And the third group, subcommittee, the Fire Data Subcommittee, really started looking at how we collect and use the data on what Colorado's fire problems are. And this group really didn't get to where we need this recommendation and this step here. What they came up with is broad goals that we need to evaluate on how we collect data. It's there's many databases. The data is sometimes a little inaccurate. We just want to make sure we have the accuracy. We want to make sure we're getting all the data that we need. So that group's really going to just push through and continue working for the next year, probably more than that, because data is a pretty complicated issue. So really, I just wanted to give you a brief update. If you go to our annual report, you can read all about how these recommendations came up, what the assumptions were behind them, and all the work that was done. And again, this is a stakeholder-driven consensus building process. We want your input. We want to know what you think are the issues that the Colorado Fire Commission should be looking at. We want you involved in our meetings. Our next meeting is October 19th. You can find all the information about it on our website. Again, coloradofirecommission.com. And go there and learn about what we're doing, read the minutes from it, read our annual report, and get involved. We want to hear from you. Thank you very much.